If there were a time portal hidden inside a movie theater that could take me to any decade, I would, without a doubt, choose the 1970s. Checking the movie listings in the newspaper, standing in line early to get the best seats, watching people come out of the theater and trying to read their faces before going in to see the film yourself, and then be lucky enough to experience a masterpiece. And why? Because today it often feels like the opposite. Avoiding spoilers, going to an almost empty cinema where you hope everyone behaves, and sometimes leaving the theater realizing you barely have anything to say about the movie, and a few hours later it's already fading from memory. But movies used to be something bigger than that. They were cultural events. And when a movie becomes a cultural event, it becomes an award contender too. You know, there was a time where the films people were lining up to see were the same films winning Academy Awards. So what happened? To understand this phenomenon, we need to head back to the beginning of the Academy itself. The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences was founded in 1927 during the height of the old Hollywood studio system, largely at the initiative of Louis B. Mayer, the head of MGM. We say old Hollywood studio system because back then the studios, in this case MGM, basically owned everything: the lots, the equipment, the scripts, the writers, the technicians, the producers, the directors, the actors, the movie theaters, basically everything. And as owners, they were making every decision involving a motion picture. Working in a studio was much closer to working in a regular corporate job nowadays. You were paid a regular salary under contract, which was often a 5 to 7 year contract, and you were paid weekly whether you were working or not, which of course you always were. But in exchange of that stability, the studio controlled absolutely everything you did. That also means people weren't making creative decisions. Those decisions were made by the head of the studio. For example, if you were a director, you were basically just following orders and directing actors at best. As I'm sure you can imagine, many Hollywood workers became increasingly unhappy with the studio system, which involved long working hours, restrictive contracts, and very little creative control. And studio executives started to realize this and started to fear labor unions could soon emerge. So Mayer decided to create the Academy, thinking that if filmmakers were recognized and respected, they might be less inclined to unionize. He's famously quoted for saying, "I found that the best way to handle filmmakers was to hang medals all over them. If I got them cups and awards, they'd kill themselves to produce what I wanted." That's why the Academy Award was created. 2 years later, in 1929, the Academy held its first awards ceremony, honoring the best films from 1927 and 1928 in a very small event that lasted roughly 15 minutes and where the winners had already been announced 3 months in advance. Ironically or not, the creation of the Academy did little to stop the labor movement in Hollywood, and within a few years, the Screen Actors Guild, the Directors Guild, and the Writers Guild formed. The guilds didn't immediately overturn the studio system, but over time they began negotiating better working conditions, clearer contracts, and eventually residual payments, changes that would slowly reshape the balance of power in Hollywood. A turning point came in a Supreme Court case known as United States versus Paramount Pictures from 1948, where the defendant was forced to sell their theater chains. Before this lawsuit, the studios produced the films, distributed them, and owned the theaters where they were shown, which limited competition and excluded independent distributors and exhibitors. If you owned an independent cinema, for example, and you wanted to screen Gone with the Wind, which was a popular film, you had to buy a film package. So Pay for this other 10 films from my studio to get that one you want included. As the studios no longer controlled the entire pipeline, independent producers had more opportunities, and the studios began losing the absolute power they had held during decades. But even then, the studios were still massive corporations, and challenging their dominance wasn't easy. The old Hollywood studio system didn't collapse overnight. Instead, it slowly began to weaken throughout the 1950s and 1960s. Audiences began shrinking, television was keeping people at home, and the studios, no longer in control of the entire pipeline, began making bigger, riskier productions in an attempt to bring audiences back to theaters. Many of those films would become the biggest financial disasters Hollywood had ever seen. In the 1960s, studios began investing enormous amounts of money into massive productions, hoping spectacle alone would bring audiences back to theaters. These films were historical epics or musicals with huge sets, thousands of extras, elaborate costumes, and so on. Their thinking was, we need to make something that television simply cannot compete with. But that strategy didn't always work. One of the most famous examples was Cleopatra, which originally had a budget of about $2 million, but eventually increased to $31 million. And even though it became the highest grossing film of 1963 with $57.7 million at the box office, it was so expensive that it nearly bankrupted the studio. In Hollywood, a film generally needs to make about 2 to 2.5 times its budget to be considered profitable, so it was a huge flop. But not every large production in Hollywood was a disaster. In 1964, Mary Poppins, produced by Walt Disney Productions, became a massive success, and it proved audiences were willing to show up for big, optimistic spectacles. Its success gave 20th Century Fox the confidence to finally release a project they had been developing for years, The Sound of Music. And their gamble paid off. By 1966, the film had become the highest grossing film of all time, even surpassing Gone with the Wind. And for Hollywood executives, the lesson seemed obvious. Let's make more musicals! One of the most ambitious attempts to recreate that formula was Dr. Dolittle from 1967. Large-scale musical plus family theme plus British fantasy plus magical connection with animals equals guaranteed success. Only it wasn't. The film quickly became infamous for its troubled production and dilated budget. Critics largely disliked it. Audiences weren't particularly enthusiastic, and the film struggled to justify its enormous cost. Yet, Dr. Dolittle received 9 Academy Award nominations, including Best Picture. At the time, many journalists and industry insiders began questioning how a film that critics had largely dismissed could receive so many nominations. What happened was the studio launched an unusually aggressive campaign to influence Academy voters. They invited voters to expensive dinners, private screenings, and they even bought complete magazine pages for months to call their movie a masterpiece. Of course, it didn't win Best Picture. It roughly got 2 awards out of the 9 nominations, thankfully. But this situation did spark some debate on how much do awards truly reflect artistic achievement and how much is shaped by money and industry politics. Just so you have an idea, that same year the highest grossing film was The Graduate, and not so far in the highest grossing list was Bonnie and Clyde, both nominated for Best Picture, both small, riskier films that connected to younger audiences in a way the big studio productions weren't. The problem was that audiences themselves were changing. Younger viewers were living through a period of cultural change. The Vietnam War, the civil rights movement, the counterculture, and films coming out of Hollywood simply felt outdated. In 1969, for example, a film like Easy Rider, made for a tiny fraction of the cost of big studio productions, suddenly became a massive hit. So Hollywood executives began to realize the future of the cinema might belong to a new generation of filmmakers who understood audiences better than they did. Enter the 1970s Renaissance. The 1970s were different for many reasons. One of the biggest changes came in 1968 when Hollywood officially abandoned the old production censorship rules, also known as the Hays Code, and replaced them with the film rating system that still exists today. Suddenly, filmmakers were able to explore darker themes, more complex characters, and stories that felt closer to real life. The creative freedom they were lacking in the old Hollywood system was finally over. At the same time, we also get the first generation of film students to arrive Hollywood with a university degree. While the old directors arrived in limousines wearing suits and waiting for instructions from the studio, the new directors arrived in jeans, listening to rock music, and talking about artistic vision. These were filmmakers like Francis Ford Coppola, Martin Scorsese, Steven Spielberg, and George Lucas. Deeply influenced by European cinema and far more interested in telling bold, personal stories, and the result was one of the most extraordinary decades in cinema history. In just a few years, audiences saw films like The Godfather, The Sting, The Exorcist, Jaws, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Rocky, Taxi Driver, Annie Hall, Star Wars. These films weren't just critically respected. They were massive cultural phenomena and remain to be today. The Godfather, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Rocky, and Annie Hall all won the Academy Award for Best Picture while also being enormous box office successes. But this didn't happen just because. It also happened because new marketing and distribution strategies were introduced. Jaws in particular introduced the wide release, which meant releasing the movie in hundreds of theaters at the same time so that people across the United States could talk about the movie on the same day. It also introduced 30-second TV ads that appeared on prime time, resulting in people's urgency to watch the movie.
From the best-selling novel, Jaws, rated PG, may be too intense for younger children.
And finally, one important ingredient. Before Jaws, the studios believed summer was a terrible time to release a motion picture, but it proved to be the opposite. Kids weren't at school, they were hanging out together, they were watching movies, and suddenly they were utterly scared to get into the water. That's when the summer blockbuster became a priority. So the 70s were about perfecting that formula of simple idea plus G rating plus adventure, suspense, or fantasy plus happy ending pretty often plus massive marketing campaign equals blockbuster. Long lost were the days of persuading voters into considering a specific picture or awarding a big spectacle just because it was a huge production. Now the pictures nominated for awards were often the same films that dominated the box office, competing against other highly artistic, highly profitable movies. And with massive viewers watching the awards, we also got to see more of the political energy of the decade. In 1973, Marlon Brando famously refused his Oscar for The Godfather and instead sent activist Sachin Littlefeather to decline the award in protest of Hollywood's portrayal of Native Americans.
And the reasons for this being are the treatment of American Indians today by the film industry.
A few years later, Vanessa Redgrave delivered one of the most controversial speeches in the history of the ceremony after winning for Julia.
And I pledge to you that I will continue to fight against anti-Semitism and fascism.
Moments like this showed that the Oscars weren't just an industry celebration. They had become part of the cultural and political conversation of the time. The decade also introduced a new generation of actors that defined a new wave of cinema. Jack Nicholson, Al Pacino, Robert De Niro, Dustin Hoffman, Meryl Streep all brought a more intense and psychologically complex style of acting. Music also found a new place in cinema during this period. After the massive but often unsuccessful musical spectacles of the 1960s, Hollywood began experimenting with different ways of using music to connect with audiences. One of the most influential figures was and still is composer John Williams, whose orchestral scores for Jaws, Star Wars, and Superman helped bring back the grand symphonic soundtracks that had largely disappeared from Hollywood films. At the same time, films like Saturday Night Fever showed that contemporary music could turn a movie into a cultural phenomenon, with its soundtrack becoming one of the best-selling albums of all time. In other words, music once again became a powerful part of the movie-going experience, extending the movie's cultural impact far beyond the theaters. Another major transformation arrived towards the end of the decade with the rise of special effects. When Star Wars was released, audiences saw a new achievement. These innovations didn't just help make Star Wars a phenomenon, they permanently changed the way movies were made, opening the door for the visual effects-driven blockbusters. Interestingly, the same year Star Wars revolutionized special effects, the award's biggest winner was Annie Hall, which was a small, character-driven comedy. Putting those two films together, Star Wars and Annie Hall's, perfectly captures the balance Hollywood had found by the end of the 1970s. Spectacular blockbusters and intimate character films could coexist, both shaping culture, both competing for the industry's highest honor. But that balance wouldn't last forever. As you can imagine, in the decades that followed, that blockbuster formula that emerged in the 1970s became the dominant strategy. Only now it had a ton of different ingredients they could pour into the mixture. High concept film plus G or PG rating plus adventure or suspense or fantasy plus special effects plus global appeal plus memorable soundtrack plus sequel possibility plus happy ending pretty often plus massive marketing campaign equals global blockbuster. And for a while, there was still a strong balance between the large-scale productions and the smaller, character-driven films. Both could become major cultural events. Both could win an Oscar. But as the blockbuster formula proved to be more and more profitable, it just kept getting bigger. Studios invested heavily in spectacle, franchise, and global appeal. And while fantasy rarely seemed Best Picture worthy, it proved it could when The Lord of the Rings: The Return of the King won Best Picture in 2003, while also becoming the highest grossing film of the year and swept every category it was nominated for.
Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King. The Lord of the Rings.
For Lord of the Rings.
The Lord of the Rings.
From the Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings.
For the Lord of the Rings.
Lord of the Rings.
Lord of the Rings.
It's a clean sweep. The Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King.
Honoured, touched and relieved that the Academy and the members of the Academy that have supported us have seen past the trolls and the wizards and the hobbits and are recognising fantasy this year.
This was the last picture that ever got both titles, Best Picture and highest grossing film. At the same time, some filmmakers began pushing in the opposite direction, trying to prove that you don't need such a spectacle for producing an Oscar-winning film. Instead, they focused on more intimate, prestige-driven projects aimed at critics and award voters rather than on massive audiences. Slowly, the balance that defined the 1970s began to disappear, and that raises the question we're all asking: what exactly do Oscars reward today? For better or worse, the formula for success eventually became a little absurd. Studios realized if spectacle, marketing, and global appeal worked once, They could simply keep expanding the formula, making films bigger, louder, more expensive, with the hope of turning them into a worldwide phenomena. At the same time, the film industry itself started changing. As budgets grew larger and international markets became more important, studios became increasingly focused on one thing above all else: box office revenue. And slowly, Hollywood began splitting into two different types of films. First, we have the larger-than-life blockbuster formula. High concept idea plus fourth quadrant appeal plus G or PG rating plus adventure or suspense or fantasy plus special effects spectacle plus global appeal plus friendly dialogue plus sequel potential plus prequel potential plus spin-off potential plus post-credit scene plus merchandising plus toys plus video games plus theme park rides plus Happy Meal collaboration plus cross-promotion with fast food plus minimal cultural specificity plus streaming series plus making of documentary plus massive marketing campaign equals entertainment ecosystem. At this point, the goal was no longer to create a successful film. It was to create an entire entertainment ecosystem. Meanwhile, another kind of formula began emerging on the other end of the spectrum: the prestige award film. Complex theme plus modest budget plus diverse cast plus directorial vision plus critical acclaim plus strong social media discourse plus limited theatrical release plus streaming platform deal equals awards contender. And honestly, trying to fit those award contender films into a formula is a little absurd as well, because what we see every year in the Oscars is very distinctive, ambitious filmmaking that absolutely deserves recognition. But could you say that you knew about those films before the nominations were announced? More and more, it feels like we need to wait for the Oscar nominations to tell us which movies we're supposed to watch. And again, these films are often deeply thoughtful, artistically ambitious, and critically respected, but they rarely, or better say never, reach massive audiences. So today we find ourselves in a very different landscape. The films dominating popular culture are often massive franchise blockbusters designed to succeed in a global marketplace, while the films celebrated at the award season are smaller projects circulating through festivals, critics lists, and social media discussions. And maybe that divide isn't surprising. After all, the way we consume culture has changed dramatically. We live in a world of constant online discourse, viral opinions, politically incorrect statements that spread instantly across the internet, algorithm-driven platforms, AI, and an attention span increasingly shaped by endless scrolling. In that kind of environment, cinema itself seems to be moving in a different direction. And if history has told us anything, is that Hollywood rarely stays the same for too long. So maybe what we're seeing right now is simply another transition. And maybe one day the film everyone is talking about is the same film winning the Oscars. Yeah, probably not.
But they sure got some cuties incorrect.